Hello and welcome to Talking Science. I'm Robin Williams. Our guest for today's episode is the popular writer Bill Bryson, who was recorded at the Perth Writers Festival in 2005. He's on stage with the ABC's Paul Willis.
So please put your hands together and welcome to the stage, Bill Bryson. Let's go back to the very beginning. When did you first have any interest in writing?
Well, English was the only thing I was any good at. Both of my parents worked for the local paper in Des Moines, Iowa, where I grew up. And my brother, who was 9 years older than I am, was kind of a surrogate adult in the background of my life. He also worked on the local paper. So it was the family business. You worked in newspapers in my house. And so it never occurred to me to do anything else other than go into newspapers.
So when you were a kid, you didn't want to be a pirate or anything? You were always going to be a writer?
Well, when I was realistic about it, I mean, yeah, of course I wanted to be a pirate and a sexual athlete and all kinds of things. But in fact, I mean, when I started to be realistic about it, I knew that in some way I'd be making my living from putting words together in some way. And when I actually started working in journalism, I never wrote. I was always a sub-editor. It wasn't until I got married and started having kids and needed to supplement my income that I began writing articles as a way of just getting a little extra money.
So can you remember the first time that you did write something that you got paid for?
Yeah. The very first article I ever wrote was a short piece about Holland and Holland, which is a very exclusive gun shop in London. And I sold it to Sports Illustrated, an American magazine, for $500, which was just, I mean, every bit of that was fantastic. It was a lot of money then, and it was a really good place to start. So I started lucky. I wrote off to lots and lots of different papers and asked for interviews, and was actually given lots of interviews. But one of them I went to was the Reading Post, I think. But anyway, the paper in Reading. And the guy was very, very dubious about me, and quite right too, really. But he said to me in the course of the interview, he said, you might have to work on a Saturday afternoon and be the only person here dealing with the little late updates box. And he said, well, if there's a big cricket test match going on, it said that England were all out for 112, what would that mean? And I said, I have no idea. And I now know, of course, that it means they're having a typical test match. But at the time, I had no idea. And so he said, no, you'll have to go away and learn a little more before we'll employ you.
I'm curious, the time that you spent in England, is that where you developed your sense of humour? Because in a lot of ways, your humour strikes me as more English than American.
Well, it's funny, because I grew up in Iowa, and the sense of humor in Iowa was, I think, very English and very British kind of humor. And I don't know what's happened in America, because it really has lost that. But people in Iowa used to make the jokes. My father, for instance, used to make really good jokes. My father was the world's greatest pun maker. I remember once when we were in California, and we were driving alongside the San Andreas Fault, and he rolled the window down and threw a quarter out because he always said he wanted to be generous to a fault. and there was always quite a lot of pretty good jokes going on, and people making fun of themselves and laughing at themselves, which is the sort of British humor. When I say British humor, I think of really everything that's all countries that aren't America in the English-speaking world. Because, Australian humor is very British in that sense, and Irish and Canadian and so on. They all kind of laugh at the same things. And America has got out on this limb, and I don't really understand how that happened. But I do know that it got me in a lot of trouble in the 8 years we were living back in America. That people, sometimes I would make jokes, and people just wouldn't realize that I was making jokes. I remember one occasion with our neighbor, who was a very literal-minded, very nice fellow. I was telling him about some nightmare airplane travel experience I'd had, where I had missed connecting flights all over the place and it took me forever to get home. And he said, "Who were you flying with?" And I said, "I don't know, they were all strangers." And he didn't get that at all.
You started writing travel articles to supplement your income. Why did you choose travel as a genre?
Well, I didn't necessarily. I mean, I did do a lot of travel articles, but as I say, the first article I ever sold was about a gun shop. It fit in with a kind of column that Sports Illustrated ran every week, which was about interesting sporting goods shops around the world. So I was just being an opportunist wherever there seemed to be a place that I might sell something. And I discovered quite early on that there was a very good market in America to sell travel pieces to Sunday newspapers. And one of the great things about it was that although no one newspaper paid very well, you could sell the same article over and over again and get $50 here and $70 there and actually make quite a good little income from it. So that was how I was doing it.
It would seem that the next step in the process was your mum lent you her Chevy and you went on a tour around the States, and that's how The Lost Continent was written?
Yes, I had this strange thing. I had been working on newspapers in Fleet Street for years and years, and increasingly I was doing freelancing, and I realized that was actually what I wanted to do, and I thought I could do it. I mean, I thought I could make a living writing, and it was a lot more enjoyable to me than what I was doing going into an office every day. And particularly at this time, I had been going into Wapping when I was working for the Times and having people throw bricks at my car, and during the time that they were settling in at Wapping. So I was looking for something a little more rewarding to do with my time, and so ended up, I guess I had bitched about this a little too much to my wife, because we went away on a holiday in Yorkshire, and I said, God, it's wonderful up here. And when we got back to England and I got back to London and I went back to work, my wife called me at work one day, which something she never normally did, and said, guess what, I've just put the house on the market. And I said, you what? And she said, yes, and what's more, somebody's coming to look at it tomorrow. And these people came the next day and put in an offer on our house, and the next thing I knew, we had committed to me quitting my job in London and moving up and buying a house in the Yorkshire Dales. And so then that's how my writing career started, because I suddenly had bills to pay and no income coming in.
You subsequently went on and you've written a string of books that are based around travels in various parts of the world, North America, Europe, down here in Australia. Have you ever had the experience of having written about somewhere you'd be dubious to go back?
Yeah. And the place that always leaps to mind is Hammerfest, which is way up above the Arctic Circle in Norway. And I went there in the depths of winter when it's dark 24 hours a day, to try and see the Northern Lights, the Aurora Borealis. And the people at Hammerfest are lovely. I mean, they're the nicest people in the world. But it is a long way away. It's incredibly cold, and it's dark 24 hours a day. And it's it was the saddest place I've ever been. I mean, one of the things that happens is that every day around midday, the temperature warms up just a tiny bit, so it gets just a hair above freezing. And what happens is all the ice that it very, very lightly melts, and then it freezes again, and so you get this very slick surface wherever there is ice. And everybody in town comes out, all the shopkeepers come out and throw sand down on it, and so you get good traction again. But every 5th or 8th or 10th shop, the people are away on holiday or they're not there, and they don't throw the sand down. So what happens is, in the dark, after midday, people are walking around in Hammerfest in the dark, and you can just hear people are walking along fine, good traction, and then they hit one of the slick bits and fall down. And so in the dark, as you're walking around Hammerfest, you're just hearing, ooh, ah! It's the most bizarre place. And it was really sad, and I couldn't wait to get out of there.
With the Down Under book, the almost universal comment I've had from people across Australia is they really loved the book, that you obviously know Australians very well, and you write about the rest of Australia, okay, but when it comes to X, add where you live in Australia, geez, he really gave us a bad rap there. And like, it's curious, it doesn't matter where you are in Australia, it doesn't matter which part you are, well, particularly Canberra. So what sort of feedback have you had about your perceptions of Australia as you expressed in that book?
Well, I mean, generally positive, I think. I mean, I do really, really like and admire this country, and I think that it came through in the book. The thing that I always get, and it does drive me just a tiny bit mad, is that Australians always insist that there is actually no danger in this country. They always insist. And they get quite irate about it sometimes, that there's no, and then in the same breath, absolutely in the same breath, they will then tell you about how last week their Uncle Bob was driving to Dubbo or something, and a tiger snake crawled out from under the dashboard and bit him on the groin. But it's okay because he's off the life support machine now, and he's learning to communicate with eye blinks. And they don't seem to see that this is actually kind of evidence that maybe there is a certain amount of danger as you live in this country.
But I mean, there's a certain amount of danger anywhere you live. I mean, you're going to get you could get mugged in Des Moines, couldn't you?
No. You could tape $20 bills to yourself in Des Moines, and you wouldn't get mugged in Des Moines. But I take your point. I mean, it is these things are perceived dangers. I mean, I've lived, a good deal of my life in the United States. I've never seen a gun pulled out. I've never heard a gunshot fired in anger. And yet everybody who comes to America thinks that there's nothing but gunplay everywhere they go. And that's, it's obvious that you would derive that impression just from watching television programs and from what the news reports you read. So I do know that actually you're not going to find tiger snakes under every seat, or funnel web spiders everywhere you go. But it is also understandable that a foreigner would be slightly fearful.
Look, a short history of nearly everything. Ambitious title. I mean, why a science book? Why did you decide to tackle science?
Well, I'd always had this feeling that science had to be more interesting than it seemed at school. I'm sorry, but I really did feel that. And it just always struck me that, we ought to be, we're interested in ourselves and all the things about us, the life that we have and the universe we live in. It's all science that explains it. I mean, we are all chemicals, and everything around us is made of chemicals. And so why did I find chemistry so stupefyingly dull in school? And I couldn't really quite understand it. I thought, at some level, this stuff has got to be interesting, and they just didn't convey it to me. So I started looking into it a little bit, and I realized very quickly that, in fact, that's right. Science is amazing. The universe is just quite extraordinary, and the things that explain it are really fantastic. And I just think that science is really sort of, teaching of science is designed for people who get it, and most of us don't get it. We just don't automatically plug into that. And we're rather left adrift. So the book is really just, science for all the rest of us.
Is it important for the rest of us to understand this stuff?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's not vital. I mean, I lived, to be 50 without knowing any of this stuff. But my life is richer now that I have learned something about it. So I think it's important to get some sense of that. I mean, we live in a remarkable universe. And also, I think scientists do themselves a great disservice by not presenting what they do more clearly to people who don't sort of automatically get it. Because, it's quite extraordinary. One of the things that I wanted to find out when I started working on the book, that's always fascinated me, I have great admiration for scientists and what they do, is not just find out what we know, but how we know what we know. I've always found that particularly fascinating. How does anybody know how much the Earth weighs, or what's going on in the middle of the planet, or how many millions of miles away Jupiter is, or any of that kind of thing? How do people figure that out? I mean, I'm just so full of admiration that people could figure that sort of thing out. And when you start looking into how they did figure it out, it often turns out to be quite an extraordinary story. I mean, just with how much the Earth weighs, a guy named Henry Cavendish figured it out 200 years ago in Clapham in London without ever leaving home. I think that's the most amazing thing. If they'd taught me that in school, I'd have paid a lot more attention.
You actually went out and interviewed a lot of scientists around the world for this book. One of the things that strikes me in all your other books is it's quite obvious when you don't like someone. And in this book, I don't recall you coming across any of the scientists and not writing about them with some admiration and liking them. Is that true? Did you like them as a bunch of people?
Absolutely. I mean, I was surprised at how welcoming they were. Every person I approached, with one or two exceptions, wrote back promptly and was very extremely helpful. I mean, I was sort of surprised because I didn't know, how much my reputation was preceding me. But if I were a scientist, I wouldn't allow me to interview me, and because I would have expected them to think that I was just out there to make fun of them or somehow be irreverent about what they do, and in fact I didn't find that they all were very happy to talk and gave me quite a lot of time, and in some cases it was really quite wonderful because nobody had ever come and seen them before. Nobody had ever actually expressed interest in things they do. People who work in really recondite, arcane areas of knowledge, sometimes, nobody had ever asked them. There was one guy in particular that I remember very fondly, was the moss man at the Natural History Museum in London. Nobody had ever said to him, let's have a look at your mosses then. and it was quite a thrilling experience that he went to all these cupboards that had actually belonged to Joseph Banks originally, just ended up as his cupboards somehow. And it's these wonderful walnut cabinets, and he was taking out all the mosses are kept in a piece of folded cardboard. And then inside that there's a bit of wax paper, and he would open it up, and you take out this just dry, nothing bit of kind of brown substance and moisten it, and it would kind of pop into life again. You can do this over and over again with mosses. It's the one thing you can do with mosses that's kind of interesting. And it would pop back into life, and it would say this is, and he'd tell me the scientific name and a little bit about it. Then he'd get another one down and get it out. And he was completely animated. And the thing that was interesting was that every moss looked exactly the same to me. But it was really sweet that he was so captivated by these little bits of nothing. And I don't mean that in a remotely cynical way. I mean, it's really important that there are people like that. And I kind of went away thinking, I don't know how anybody could be like that, but the world is a better place because some people are.
Were there any other favourites that stand out that you were really glad to meet?
Well, there's other people that whose work I'd read. For instance, also at the Natural History Museum was Richard Fortey, a man I'm sure you're well acquainted with in your line, but a paleontologist and a man who wrote a fantastic book called The Earth, Life, an Unauthorized Biography. A really, really wonderful book that actually, I didn't know it was coming out when I was working on mine, but it really covered an awful lot of the ground that I was trying to cover, and did it extremely well from a much more learned perspective than anything I could do. And he was very, very generous again, and he took me around. His thing is trilobites, which are just these ancient fossils, that things that used to swim around in primordial seas. And again, the feeling of animation and the sense of excitement that he has, and the way he could take just a piece of old stone with a bit of shape to it, the fossil stone, and recreate ancient seas from it, was really quite exciting. As whole worlds were opening up to me that I never suspected existed.
Were there difficult scientists that you came across?
Difficult scientists? No, but there was a lot of difficult science. I mean, really a lot of difficult science. And I remember the scientists were always very helpful, but as a journalist, as a writer, I would always want it to be simple. I mean, I want every explanation I give to be simple. And obviously science is not often like that. And just to put it to give you an analogy that I can understand, my instinct would be to write, in effect, in baseball, there are two ways to be put out. The batter can swing and miss a third strike, or he can hit the ball and be thrown out by a fielder. And I'd go to my physicist friend and say, is that right? And he'd say, well, no, actually, there's way more than two ways to be put out, that there's also, it can be a drop third strike, or, I don't know if you know, but Leibowitz at Caltech is doing a great thing with foul balls caught in foul territory. And just going, actually, there's about 22 ways to, or maybe there's 26, I don't know, there's at least maybe 3 dozen. And I'd go, I can't possibly describe all. So then in the end, I would sort of write, nobody knows how many ways there are to be put out in baseball. But it was that kind of constant compromise and trying to get to be accurate, but keep it accessible to general reader.
You also speak really fondly of the dead scientists, because there's a lot of them. And I was just curious, if you could wave a magic wand and bring half a dozen of them back for a dinner party, are there any that stand out that you really would want to meet?
I would love to meet Einstein. I just think he was a fascinating guy. I'd love to meet Niels Bohr, who was again, it just seemed like a wonderful human being as well as a great genius. But I think most of all, I'd love to just see Isaac Newton, and I'd love to see Isaac Newton talking to Albert Einstein. I think that would be incredible. What Einstein could tell him. I mean, what on earth would he make of it? He'd be.
Do you think you'd be able to follow the conversation?
No, I'd be completely lost. I would be completely lost. But I would probably be useful as somebody would need to be there to explain to them why they were alive again.
Reading through the book, one of the lines that I'm surprised comes up as often as it does, and it's usually a scientist responding to one of your questions, is, "We don't know." Are you surprised how little, in a way, or how many holes there are in science?
Yeah, I was constantly surprised by that, and how much we don't know. And also what surprised me was how much we thought we knew, like when I was in high school, that was wrong. I mean, like everything, almost everything I was taught I graduated from high school in 1970, and most things I was taught were wrong. I mean, we didn't know about plate tectonics, or if we did, I mean, it wasn't a really accepted theory. And bear in mind, of course, that my textbooks weren't written in 1970. Most of them were written in sort of 1959 or 1962. I mean, they were some years old. So quite a lot of the stuff that I was taught was wrong and was proved out of date. And the whole theories about, dinosaur extinctions and things like that, all the things that tend to be common knowledge now or conventional thought now were overwhelmingly not known or even conceived of back then. And it does make you wonder, what are we certain about now that everybody will be kind of snickering about 20 years from now? And I have no idea.
It struck me too, reading through the book, that there were some chapters you enjoyed writing more than others. Some of them seem to have just that little extra zing, particularly if the chapter involves very large numbers or destroying things. You seem to like. Is that a fair observation? Is that actually true? There were parts of the book that you enjoyed writing more than others?
Oh, yeah, inevitably. That's always the case with any book you do, and some parts are a lot harder than others. In this book, there were two parts that really surprised me that were really hard. One was particle physics, which didn't surprise me. I mean, I expected anything to do with the subatomic world to be hard to understand, hard to get a grasp of, and so it proved. But the other part that really surprised me, that was hard, was the whole thing about human origins. It's just so unbelievably complex, and there's so much bitchiness and rancor and disagreement about how to interpret these things. And almost every ancient bone or piece of chip of skull that gets found ends up in a new species, and sometimes historically in a new genus as well. So you end up with this great proliferation of names that you have to try and sort through. And a lot of them have been discarded over the years. I can never remember, but I just marked a page in my book where I was just glancing through the book today to try and sort of refresh myself on this. And I mean, to understand human origins, you've got to understand the differences between hominids, hominidi, hominins, hominini, and hominoidi. And of course, I mean, it was for a layperson, it's impossible to really grasp that. And the other thing that struck me when I was looking at that today was that just a group of people called the Solo people, which were, I think, if I recall correctly, Java people, have been variously known as Homo soloensis, Homo Primigenesis Asiaticus, Homo neanderthalensis soloensis, Homo sapiens soloensis, Homo erectus, and finally plain Homo erectus. And those are all names they've had. So depending on which kind of book you're reading, how up to date it is, in order to understand about those people, you'd need to know that they have been called different things at different times. This is over a period of 25 years or so. So that was really, really complicated.
Are you surprised at the success of the book? I mean, it's sold over 1 million copies now. Are you surprised at that success for a science book?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Pleased, obviously.
Well, yeah. But no, because you just never know. When you do something, you really don't know how it's going to be received. And I knew that this was a sort of high-risk operation. And both in terms of how it might be reviewed and also how it might be received by people who expect other kinds of writing from me, and much more in the way of jokes and things. So I just didn't know how it would go. And so because it's done well, I mean, it was hugely gratifying, as you can imagine. It was just a dream come true that it's done so well.
Just quickly on the actual process of writing. I read today that apparently your wife describes you as incredibly irritable when you're in the process of writing. Do you enjoy writing, or is there, like, you like the research, but actually sitting down and putting pen to paper is difficult? How does that whole process work for you?
I like most, I think it's true of most writers, I don't like the getting up in the morning and be confronted with a blank computer screen and think that I've got to fill it somehow. And what I do, my only secret is I don't mess around in the morning. I get up quite early, I allow myself 1 cup of coffee with my wife and sit at the kitchen table and chat to her for a minute. But then with my 2nd cup of coffee, as I'm waking up, I go straight to my desk. And so sort of as the computer is coming to life, so am I. And we sort of confront each other simultaneously. And that seems to help, that I start working before I'm really 100% awake. And that then it isn't such a sort of trauma for me mentally. But then once you start working, you really get into it, and it becomes, you don't want to leave. It's hard for people to pull you away from it. You really get resentful if you have to get up and walk away from it at some point. It's a really interesting process, because there's nothing that I dread more than having to start on something, and nothing that I enjoy more once I've actually started on it.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that's your lot, but it's been an absolutely fascinating evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Bryson.
Thank you very much.